Lightning doesn't strike twice in the same place.
Common weather myth, lightning doesn't strike twice. It does, absolutely all the time. Now the odds of any point on Earth getting struck twice are slim because, you know, lightning's the size of a pencil. But think of the Empire State Building or some other skyscraper that has a lightning rod on it. Lightning strikes there all the time, so lightning can strike twice. Hey GQ, I'm David Yeomans, and this is The Breakdown. First up, the day after tomorrow.
We have live coverage now from our Fox 11 chopper. Are you there, Bart?
Yes, I'm here.
Natural disasters are naturally occurring, horrible catastrophes that we have no control over and that we oftentimes can't even predict. Some natural disasters like tornadoes or hurricanes, they happen at different parts of the world and they can happen many times in a given year. Right off the bat, this is a really spectacular scene, but this part of the movie is taking place in LA. While LA has had some small, weak tornadoes over the past 50 or 60 years, we've never had multiple tornadoes like this in Los Angeles, and we've never had intense tornadoes like these appear to be in Los Angeles. So a tornado is a violently spinning and rising column of air. Typically it happens in a supercell thunderstorm, which is when you have a really intense thunderstorm with all this rising air called an updraft. But then you also have what's called wind shear, which is winds at different heights in the atmosphere blowing different directions and also at different speeds. And if all those things come together just right, you have not only rising air inside of the storm, but you have rising and spinning air inside of the storm. These tornadoes here have more of the appearance of what's called a supercell thunderstorm. So these are the tornadoes that happen in Oklahoma or the Midwest or even parts of Texas. This is where the conditions in the atmosphere are conducive for really intense and spectacular tornadoes. The ones that happen in LA, on the rare occasion that they do happen, they would generally be much skinnier, much smaller. To make a tornado like this in the Midwest, where it usually happens, you need warm, moist air down at ground level, down at the surface. Generally in LA, you have this cool, stable air near the surface, and actually the air a few thousand feet high is warmer than it is down at the ground, so it makes tornadoes like this very unlikely.
We have live coverage now from our Fox 11 chopper. Are you there, Bart?
While we have observed multiple tornadoes at once, it's usually just two tornadoes side by side, and that, even in the Midwest or Tornado Alley, is very rare. So seeing something like this in Los Angeles, where they really rarely even get tornadoes, would be pretty unheard of. The most tornadoes I'm aware of happening simultaneously is 3, but it was from an old photograph and it's quite rare. Tornadoes are so sensitive to their environment, and that's why they never last for that long, usually at least. They need everything to be just right, and if one thing disrupts that, it's gone. You know, you would think it'd be very dangerous to fly a helicopter near a tornado, but they actually do this pretty frequently in places like Oklahoma. A lot of the news stations up there have helicopters, and during tornado outbreaks, they'll put their choppers up in the sky to give their viewers the best view of the tornado. So this can actually be done. It's kind of a common myth actually, is that mountains protect you from tornadoes or hills protect you from tornadoes. The truth is that tornadoes can happen in mountains and they can happen in hilly terrain. Why we typically think of tornadoes as happening on flat land, that's just because of where Tornado Alley is. It's in the Midwest, in Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and most of that land is flat, but it's not the flat land that causes the tornadoes. It just happens to be where the meteorological ingredients come together. The US has the most tornadoes out of anywhere in the world, and we'll get hundreds of tornadoes every single year, maybe even some that we don't know about because they happen where the radar can't see very well or where nobody actually saw it with their eyes.
What you're seeing are 2 actual tornadoes striking Los Angeles International Airport. Wait, it looks like they joined and formed one large tornado. Oh my God!
This is unrealistic just from the news perspective, because when you're a reporter live on air, you would never be driving and having your photographer in the front seat. Driving is distracting enough. Driving in a tornado is really distracting. 2 tornadoes like this typically don't combine into one. It's not completely unheard of. Their circulations don't necessarily attract each other. If anything, they kind of like to be separated. So when 2 tornadoes come together, they may actually fizzle out entirely because they may kind of counteract one another or mess up the other's environment.
Unbelievable, it's huge! I've never seen it.
Okay, wait, pause it. There's so much stuff to tear apart in this. So that was a seismograph, which measures earthquakes. So apparently now there's tornadoes causing earthquakes, which is not a thing. Earthquakes are a geological phenomenon that happens underground And tornadoes are an atmospheric thing. They happen up above the ground.
Nightmare! Only this is the real thing!
If a tornado throws some debris, you know, that's been lofted up in the cloud and then it kind of drops it outside of the wind zone, if you will, that's realistic. That can happen. Something can plop down onto the ground. But if this billboard is getting carried straight up sideways and it creams this guy and takes his body away just like that, he wouldn't have been able to be standing there in the first place, because I know from experience in hurricanes, it's almost impossible for a grown person to stand up in a 60, 65 mile an hour wind or stronger. These violent tornadoes have winds of well over 100 or 150 miles an hour, it looks like. So if they're gonna throw this billboard past him, it is unrealistic that he would just be able to stand there until the billboard crushes him. That destruction of a well-built skyscraper is very difficult for any tornado to accomplish. Even an EF5 is the strongest on the scale. The enhanced Fujita scale, 0 is the weakest on the tornado scale. They have winds of less than 100 miles per hour. EF5 is the strongest, and those have winds of over 200 miles per hour. We've even had Doppler radar measurements of tornadic winds over 300 miles per hour before, which is pretty unheard of. All right, let's fast forward to later in this same movie. So right there, we were looking from space down into a really intense hurricane, probably a category 4 or 5, and the scale only goes up to 5. This is unrealistic because a hurricane is a really warm cored storm. You would never have a hurricane and a snowstorm or whatever's going on here simultaneously in the same place. Hurricanes have really moist, warm air feeding into them, kind of like a tornado. You can't have a cold cored hurricane like this one appears to be. I love what this thing is modeled after, because it is modeled after a real historical event 10,000 years ago, a mini ice age. It was called the Younger Dryas event. So what happened was the Earth was warming 10,000 years ago, and that global warming actually melted so much of the ice from Greenland into the North Atlantic Ocean that freshwater melt threw off all of the ocean currents. Europe especially went into a mini ice age on a very, very short scale, just about 10 years. That, in the scale of climate, was called abrupt climate change. But happening like this is very unrealistic, where in this movie it just happens in minutes or hours. To get something like this looks like you're pouring liquid nitrogen all over it, which is like 400 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Skyscrapers can survive -20 or -40 degrees as long as they're built for it, like we have up in the northern US and in Canada. Actually having something freeze the building like this and explode the windows, that's very unrealistic as far as being caused from weather. If there were some sudden freeze like this, the air wouldn't travel downward. If anything, in the atmosphere, actually, when you have sinking air, it heats the air up. So having the air crawl down the buildings like this into this ultra freeze is a little shaky. So a second ago, we were kind of in the eye of the hurricane. You could see, they call that the stadium effect, where you're looking at this stadium, it's like football stadium, and you're the player, of clouds around you that are 40 or 50,000 feet high. And that's real for a hurricane, but it's not real for whatever intense freeze this is. The eye of the hurricane like that, you would see the sun and you would see the spectacular ring of clouds around you, but it wouldn't be below 0 like it is here. It'd be really warm, actually.
Close the door! Don't let the fire go out!
This whole monster, you know, coming through the hallways at you is not quite how weather works. And a fire like that could keep the room warm if it's below 0 in the rest of the house or in the rest of that building. But then of course the question becomes, how long does it stay that cold outside from this disaster, and how long can you keep the fire going? So in freezing temperatures, it's always good to stay at home, because a lot of people get in trouble traveling on the roadways in a snowstorm, and then they end up sliding off the road or getting into a car accident, and then they're stranded. So if you do have to travel, we always recommend that you have a survival kit basically in the trunk, blankets, big parkas or jackets, some food or water. The best way to do it though is to just stay home. I really like what the movie is modeled after. Global warming actually leading to abrupt global cooling, because that did happen 10,000 years ago, but happening in this way and this dramatic with the whole hurricane spinning over you, those were all added in by Hollywood, unfortunately. Next up, The Crown.
London has been brought to a halt by dense fog, which has descended overnight.
Good God.
The Meteorological Office has issued a statement saying that a persistent anticyclone over London is to blame.
This is very meteorologically accurate. So this was the Great London Smog of 1952 and Thousands of people died, and they said it's because of an anticyclone. Well, a cyclone is a storm, and typically storms have rising air, and that's how clouds and rain form. In an anticyclone, it's kind of like the opposite. Air actually sinks on top of you. So if you have air sinking on top of you and you're in 1950s London with no pollution controls, it smushes all that smog, which would usually disperse into the higher levels of the atmosphere, right down at ground level. It's sort of like a temperature inversion that you see over LA. And it can really create super dense and very, very unhealthy smog. And that's what happened for a few days. Smog is like a dirty fog. Smog is caused by pollution. It's particles like soot or ash or car exhaust that hang out at ground level. Fog is just a cloud on the ground. So fog is much more pure.
Expected to last for some time. Be careful out there. It's a real pea souper.
This lasted so long because of the weather pattern. Dirty, growing, populous city was emitting all this stuff into the atmosphere, and usually they can do that because the wind blows it away or it disperses into the levels of the atmosphere. But this persistent sinking air and very calm conditions in the city just trapped all the emissions and all the pollutants right there. And it was actually so unhealthy that it killed thousands of people in a short amount of time. In some cities around the world, you know, Los Angeles, parts of China, where we have a lot of people in a tiny area and certain weather patterns, you can get smog and really dangerous, hazardous air that's bad to breathe. You see people wearing masks just walking around even before COVID-19. LA has such bad smog, for instance, because the cold Pacific Ocean makes the air right here at the surface and in LA cooler than it would otherwise be. If you have cold air under warm air, it's just trapped right there in place, and that's why some of the smog can get trapped too. So this is actually a bad idea. In pollution and smog that's that thick and that unhealthy, you don't want to be outside, and especially outside exerting yourself where you breathe more of the particles in. You want to be inside, because inside, even in 1950s London, it would have provided you some level of protection from that outside dirty air. And now, you know, with our air filtration in our homes and businesses, it would provide you a lot of protection from air that dirty. She wanted to keep her appointment, which is admirable, but it's actually what killed a lot of people, is being out in it for a long time. Next up, only the brave.
Prepare deployment site right here, now!
Can't go back up there.
There's no time, Jesse.
This is about a real fire in Arizona that killed a bunch of expert firefighters. Lightning is actually a huge cause of wildfires, and it was the cause of this actual fire in reality as well. It's especially dangerous in the desert, where you can have what's called dry lightning. It's a thunderstorm that's producing lightning and thunder, and it's trying to produce rain, but the rain actually evaporates on its way down to the ground because the air is so dry in a desert. So then you have a spark, right? But you don't have any water falling from the storm to put a fire out. So lightning-caused fires are actually super frequent, and they're very, very dangerous.
Guys, we are in front of the flaming front!
Huge fires can actually create their own weather systems. It's fascinating. Fires are so hot and so big sometimes and so intense that it creates this huge current of rising air. That current of rising air can make winds within the fire zone 60, 70 miles per hour, as strong as a hurricane. It can also create its own cloud, or even sometimes its own thunderstorm right above it. So when an electric charge builds up in a cloud, an opposing electric charge builds up on the ground underneath it, and then to get comfortable, boom, it releases the charge, discharging a bolt of lightning. Obviously, drier terrains are more likely to catch fire than wetter terrains or places that get a lot of moisture or are close to the ocean or swampland. The drier the fuel is, like a tree or some grass, the easier that fuel is going to burn.
We go on the south side of the fire then.
Wildfires can move at 15 miles an hour or even faster in localized areas depending on the wind, and these guys, it's heartbreaking. 19 of some of the best firefighters in the world were killed that day. If you get trapped inside of a wildfire like they unfortunately were, obviously fire is the main issue, but also fires that big can use up all the oxygen in the area, so that becomes a different problem as well. Wildfires produce so much smoke and ash into the atmosphere that it can travel across states, it can travel across countries, continents, and oceans, and it can have a cooling effect because it can block the sun at a certain location, kind of like a cloud is over you. Or if it travels at lower levels of the atmosphere, it can actually degrade the air quality and be dangerous to breathe. Even, you know, we saw an air quality effect in Texas from the California wildfires about less than a year ago, because the smoke, you know, moves throughout the atmosphere. Everything is connected. That's why what happens here doesn't stay there in the world of weather. Next up, Twister.
You gotta get further ahead of it.
I know what I'm doing.
Cut across the field, Bill.
I know I have to get ahead of it.
So this was made in the 90s. I mean, this got a whole generation of people into the weather, including me. And the special effects, even from back in the 90s, I think really hold up pretty well today. This looks like a very realistic tornado. You've got debris spinning around on the ground, which is dirt or whatever else is chewed up by the tornado. And then the condensation funnel is basically that tornado itself. It's the cloud that extends to the ground that you see here. So the whole premise of the movie is also pretty realistic. You've got storm chasers who do this sometimes for a living, and you've got people trying to put meteorological instruments in the way of a tornado so we can actually make measurements inside of a tornado. People still have limited success doing because tornadoes are so unpredictable and so quick. It's really, really hard to put an instrument in the way of a tornado and then get yourself out of there before it eats you up too. Weather forecasting technology has really advanced since the 90s, but predicting tornadoes, especially exactly when and where they're gonna form, is still super tricky. So if we learn more about how it works, we can understand it better and we can predict them better. If we can predict them better, then we can keep more people safe.
This is 3 miles southeast. Let's see what she does.
Tornadoes can bend like that. I know it looks kind of wild, but especially what we call a rope tornado, which is this one right here. It's very skinny like a rope from the cloud to the ground. They can kind of meander and wave to and fro, even as tornadoes generally move from southwest to northeast, because that's the way the winds in the atmosphere are generally blowing when it's conducive for a tornado. They can still wobble on that path, which is another reason it's really, really dangerous to chase a tornado and to be that close to it.
Coming towards you, Joe.
I'm not sure what they accomplished by going into a dirt gully 10 feet beside the road where they already were. I guess they're trying to get in front of the tornado to put Dorothy, the weather instruments, in the way, but now they're trapped here. Also, you heard right there, the tornado's growling. Tornadoes obviously don't make any animalistic noises like that. They've been described as freight trains pretty often because of the massive amount of wind and debris that it's chewing up, as we say. But it's not gonna sound quite like a lion or a tiger like this. You really never know the path that a tornado is exactly gonna take, and that's why storm chasing is still super dangerous. Even with all the technology we have and people who have been doing it professionally for decades, they still die sometimes because they get too close or in the wrong path of the wrong tornado. And that happened, just less than 10 years ago in Oklahoma. So tornado chasing is still something that's really, really dangerous even to this day. Tornadoes typically move maybe 20 to 40 miles per hour. So you could technically outdrive a tornado, but we really advise people not to do that because at home or at your business or at your school is the safest place. If you are trying to outdrive it, A, there might be a traffic jam because other people are trying to do that, and then you get stuck in traffic and you get in the path of a tornado. Or B, the tornado might be moving at 60, 70 miles per hour and you're on neighborhood streets or somewhere else where you're not able to go that fast. There are a few easy things to keep in mind. Indoors, in the lowest floor of the building, or ideally underground in a basement if you have one, and away from exterior walls and windows. And the reason for being as low as possible is because if you're on the second or third floor, the winds in a tornado are actually stronger up there because they don't get slowed down by friction with the Earth's surface. You notice they're both looking into the tornado, which is also a theme of this movie. From so close, the winds would be so strong, actually blowing toward the tornado, that you probably wouldn't be able to have your eyes open much at all because there's dust and debris floating around. Your eyes would really hurt if you did open them. Really, really dangerous thing to do.
Find something to grab a hold of! I know!
They're actually doing it pretty right. You're supposed to get as low to the ground as possible in a ditch or gully to try to, simulate that underground thing to get out of the wind. The common thing about going under an overpass and wedging your body under an overpass has actually been debunked, and that's a very, very dangerous thing to do. The winds can funnel underneath there and get even stronger. And also, if multiple people try to do that, then you've got a traffic jam and you've got people competing for the same space. That's very realistic. Tornadoes have winds so strong they can pull wooden planks off of whatever they're nailed to. Even more impressive than that, it can not only throw nails really, really fast, it can actually throw a plastic straw into a stump of a tree. There's a picture after an EF5 tornado, the strongest on the scale. So really, really powerful stuff. It's really tough to guess based on looking at a tornado how strong it is. As a general rule, the skinnier it is, the weaker it is, and the wider it is, the stronger it is. But you can't always tell. Even if the radar tells you how strong the winds are, which it does, you can't tell how strong it really is on the ground. And if the tornado is just over an open field, we actually don't know how strong it was because we only know how strong a tornado was based on the damage it does to whatever type of building it was and how stable that construction was. It might be an unknown intensity, and that's the way it goes down in the record books, is an EFU for unknown.
Where's my truck?
Tornadoes can certainly loft cars and farm machinery like you saw there, but it wouldn't happen as neatly as you saw, just kind of rising up like the resurrection. And it also would be so windy where our heroes are that they would probably get sucked up too. If it can lift a car 10 feet from you, then that delineation between tornadic winds and calm air is not that sharp. It's kind of a blurred line, if you will, of really, really windy stuff. So it can certainly pick up a truck and drop it somewhere else. It could even drop it farther away than this. Tornadoes can also disappear at the drop of a hat like that. They're super sensitive to their environment. So if something stops or if something goes amiss in the environment, the tornado can just disappear like that. Next up, the Wolf of Wall Street.
We might run into some chop.
Chop? We can handle chop, right? I mean, it's a 170-foot yacht.
This movie's crazy. So this is actually, everything in this one, as far as I can tell, is quite realistic. This is based on a true story, not only after the actual Wolf of Wall Street in the 90s, but this exact situation. And the captain actually had some reservations because there was, according to the weather forecast, supposed to be a small storm and some chop, as they called it. And then they got into some trouble. Chop is just rough waters on the ocean. So if you're in a 170-foot yacht, you can handle some chop. Chop is like 1 to 3 foot seas or maybe 5 foot seas, how big the waves are. But what they get into is not chop. It's, you know, deadly, terrifying seas that no private yacht like this could survive. Storms at sea, we don't obviously have weather instruments, we don't have weather stations positioned around the ocean. So at sea, we rely more on satellite data. So the satellites are orbiting the Earth, so it can see all of the clouds, it can even detect the winds at the surface, and it does so actually by detecting the wave height on the surface and using complex math to derive how strong the winds are to get waves that height. So this type of storm is actually called a mistral, and it happens in the Mediterranean Sea. And what happens is something causes the wind from the Alps to rush down through the Alps and across the Mediterranean toward Africa. And these winds can get really, really strong, and they're actually quite hard to predict even to this day. Mistrals are more of a localized effect. They happen when hot air rises to the south of the Mediterranean Sea, so air rushes in to fill the void, and you get really strong winds blowing across the Mediterranean Sea. So it's a totally different phenomenon. It's not swirling like a hurricane is, and it's a smaller scale feature than a hurricane is too.
Wait! A 20 feet high building! Turn around, let's fully on the f***ing way!
You could have 20-foot waves from hurricane force winds for sure. And the waves in an event like this, as strong as it was, can be 50 feet or even higher. You probably wouldn't have the moon at all, so it wouldn't be this bright at all. You'd be in the middle of a storm and clouds, and it'd be quite dark outside. You wouldn't be able to see the ocean as well as we can see it here. Now, yachts like this do have really powerful headlights, basically, and also side lights and backlights, so they can light up the immediate area around them, but we wouldn't be able to see the whole ocean like this. That's kind of for effect, I think.
Hold on! Get away from the window! Blow away!
It's every captain's worst nightmare. If you have 20 or even 50-foot seas like we had here, and there's a rogue waves can actually be 1.5 times that height or even twice that height. A rogue wave is where two waves come together just right to where they kind of double each other. You know, we call it constructive interference instead of destructive interference in physics. They can actually build upon each other, and that can double the wave height, which is, it looks like what happens here. Next up, War of the Worlds. This is one of my favorite things about weather is, you know, in our age of digital distractions and phones always in front of our faces, weather has the power to make everybody stop what they're doing. It can kind of captivate everybody and take the center stage. That's one of the things that I love most about it. So the light in the middle of it is baffling. I would think there's probably an alien invasion happening. But a dark lowering of the clouds that's swirling like this, that could be a wall cloud, which is the beginning signs of a tornado.
What?
The wind is blowing toward the storm.
That is weird.
There are a few things in this movie that are actually pretty meteorologically in tune, and that was one of them. He said it's so weird the wind is blowing toward the storm. So typically in a storm, if you have rain coming out of a cloud and coming toward the ground, that rain cools the air, it hits the ground, and it has nowhere to go but out. But this can actually be another sign of a tornado, because instead of rain-cooled air hitting the ground and spreading out from the storm, it's inflow. It's the storm itself sucking air in at the ground level into what could become that rotating column of air that's the tornado. So a typical thunderstorm cloud is just kind of low and it's dark and it might be kind of messy. We call it a scud cloud sometimes. It looks like just debris of weird clouds littered around.
Are you okay?
Where's the thunder?
We all know what thunder sounds like, and if you're that close to lightning, it's really a loud cracking and like a deafening boom. So that's what they would be hearing. It sounds a little bit weird, and he's kind of picking up that maybe this isn't weather related. You can certainly have lightning without rain, but you can't have lightning without thunder. There's always thunder. It's just you're too far away from it. Lightning causes thunder because it superheats the air to 50,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It's way hotter than the surface of the sun even. So when it superheats the air in an instant like that, it creates a sonic boom that radiates outward from the lightning strike itself, and that's thunder. If you're super close to it, it sounds like a really loud crack, and if you're really far away from it, it's more of a slow rolling boom. In a lightning storm, if you're outside, you are in danger of being struck, even if you're 10 or 20 miles away from the storm and it's not even raining where you are. We call that a bolt from the blue, because there can actually be sun shining, but if there's a storm next to you nearby, you can actually get struck by lightning and killed. In a lightning storm, the safest place to be is in a vehicle, which is kind of conducts the electricity around you and is grounded or insulated by the rubber tires. Or at home is even better. If the worst does happen and lightning strikes close to your home, or if it strikes your home, it's unlikely to actually conduct the electricity to your body.
It's not gonna hit there again. Okay, because lightning doesn't strike twice in the same place.
Common weather myth, lightning doesn't strike twice. It does, absolutely all the time. Now the odds of any point on Earth getting struck twice are slim because, you know, lightning's the size of a pencil, and you know, what are the odds of that versus somewhere else? But think of the Empire State Building or some other skyscraper that has a lightning rod on it. Lightning strikes there all the time, so lightning can strike twice. Next up, Mad Max Fury Road. So what they're driving into is a big dust storm, which meteorologically is called a haboob. The word has origins in the Middle East, where they actually see dust storms like this. But you can get them here in the desert Southwest in the US. This can happen along a front, you know, a big gust of wind that comes from a cold front or from a thunderstorm with cool air expanding outward from it. Basically a big gust of wind blows over the desert and it picks up all the sand and dirt and dust particles and it lofts them into the air, even a couple thousand feet into the air, and it creates this big cloud that's blowing towards you. What you're really just seeing is a big gust of wind blowing towards you, but it's visible all of a sudden because there's all kinds of dust and particles in it. I don't know that there's much of a difference practically between a dust storm and a sandstorm. Maybe the size of the particles that are being lofted. Both dust and sandstorms create really low visibility, gusty winds, and actually hazardous conditions. If a dust storm's ever coming at you like that, going inside is the best case scenario. If you are trapped outside in a vehicle, you want to stop because you won't be able to see much all of a sudden when it hits. If you're really outside walking in it, you want to get eye protection on as soon as you can. You also want to maybe wrap a cloth around your face or have a face mask on of some sort that'll protect your lungs from breathing in those particles. Dust storms can have winds of maybe 30 or 40 miles per hour, maybe 50 miles an hour in a really strong one, but they're not really known for damaging winds or strong winds. They're just known for dropping visibility and looking really spectacular if you see one. So this is based on reality, but it's dramatized a bit. The lightning, there's no reason there would be lightning inside of a dust storm. So that's one thing that's a little bit inaccurate here. So now it's almost like he's breached the wall of the dust storm and now he's inside of it and he can all of a sudden see everything. That's not quite the way these dust storms or haboobs work. It would just be a constant cloud of low visibility and dust. you don't really get inside of it and are all of a sudden able to see. You would not have sand tornadoes or dust tornadoes inside of a dust storm. There's no reason meteorologically that you would ever have a tornado inside of this. A big wall of dust, a big haboob can blow across, tens of miles or even hundreds of miles in a massive one, but typically they last for a pretty short amount of time, maybe an hour or two at the most. The biggest ones, you can actually see them from space, from satellites, if they're really wide and they last for a little while. But the smaller scale ones may just be a few miles across and last a shorter amount of time. This is one of the more unrealistic dust storms I've seen in Hollywood movies. When they were driving outside of it toward it, it did look realistic with a big, high and massive wall of dust. But once you get inside of it, the lightning is fake. The good visibility, that wouldn't happen. And once you get inside of it, these massive tornadoes, that would not happen either. Probably one of the more accurate things here is that there can be this reddish or orange hue to the dust itself. It just matters about what color the land is or what color the dust is that strong wind is picking up. It looks like it's illuminated by the sun here, which wouldn't be the case, just because of the low visibility caused by the dust cloud itself. Next up, the impossible. This is quite realistic. This is actually modeled after the 2004 Indonesian tsunami, one of the deadliest in history. A tsunami is an undersea earthquake. So in an earthquake, two pieces of land along a fault line in between them are either displaced sideways or vertically. And in this event, part of the ground underneath the ocean was displaced vertically all of a sudden more than 100 feet. So it's like if you took half of your bathtub, split it into two, and it's full of water, and then you lifted half of your bathtub up really high. That water would slosh everywhere all of a sudden, right? That's exactly what happened in this tsunami. And a tsunami wave is not like a typical wave that you can kind of dive through and then come out the other side, which goes like this. A tsunami wave is just an increase in the level of the ocean that just comes in like a wall, and it stays deep and high. So it's not a wave that crashes over you and then it's gone. It's just like the ocean is all of a sudden 20 feet higher, and it bulldozes everything that it takes over. So before a tsunami happens, oftentimes they say that the animals know or the birds may be flying away. But what you're seeing here is actually, it looks like the wind was blowing out toward the sea. The ocean can often retreat in advance of a big tsunami wave, and that actually has a deadly effect. All the tourists here in Indonesia or wherever the tsunami may be flock out to the ocean, and they even walk in the seabed because this is so cool, the ocean is disappearing, what's going on? But the ocean is only drawing out to come back in a major destructive, deadly way, and that's what we're seeing here. Predicting a tsunami is as hard as predicting an earthquake. There's actually this tsunami warning center for the whole world that operates out in the Pacific, and all they do is monitor earthquakes that happen on the ocean bed or anything close to the ocean bed that could potentially cause a tsunami. So if there's an earthquake detected that they think could cause a tsunami, they'll issue a tsunami warning for the affected coasts. And in this case, folks did not have much warning at all. Tsunamis happen most often in the Pacific Basin as opposed to the Atlantic Ocean, although they can happen anywhere. And the reason is we've all heard of the Ring of Fire, which is the big fault line that circles around the whole Pacific Ocean. That's kind of where most of the Earth's active volcanoes are, and that's where the active fault lines are. So that's where a lot of the underwater earthquakes are. A tsunami is just a huge wave, so where you are, it might not last for that long, but it can propagate across the whole ocean for hours and hours. And it's actually interesting, if you have a really deep ocean, this tremendous amount of energy in a tsunami wave is actually just a few inches high because it's kind of dispersed throughout the depth of the ocean from the floor up to the air we breathe. If you're out on a cruise ship, a tsunami might pass by you at several hundred miles per hour in the deep ocean without you even noticing. It's a tiny little wave and then it's gone. But as it approaches land, it slows down and it builds up higher and higher because the sea gets shallower. So the tsunami, when it hits shore, a shallower ocean bed, they can be 20 feet high, 40 feet high, or even over 100 feet high in the worst tsunamis. So, a big wave crashing into a hotel like this is absolutely realistic. And flowing water is exponentially more powerful than flowing air, like wind. So, you know, having a chunk of water flowing through a house at 5 miles per hour or 30 miles per hour or whatever, it can wipe everything off of the map, as opposed to, you know, a 30 mile per hour wind, which we can all sustain. To prepare for a tsunami, you just have to go to higher land and hope that you have enough time to get there. If you're vacationing on the beach like these unfortunate folks were, and there is no warning, you probably will not survive a tsunami. They're one of the least survivable natural disasters because of the power of the water and the drowning risk. Tsunamis can certainly travel a few miles inland from the beach, actually, which is pretty terrifying if you think about it. It seems safe that far away. But as long as the land is flat, and if the tsunami has the power to do so, it will bulldoze everything for several miles. So a big, powerful tsunami, one of the most powerful tsunamis we've ever seen, hitting a very flat land like we are here in Indonesia, it's really a worst case scenario. Next up, Dante's Peak. Great movie, I think it's a lot of fun. And it also holds up pretty well today, even though it's a little older. Special effects are cool. The volcano science seems pretty realistic to me. What we're seeing right here is the volcano kind of blowing its top. So all the hot magma and gases that are built up inside of the earth, typically, they, for one reason or another, are exploding out of the top of this mountain. So that right there is the pyroclastic cloud. It's a cloud of super hot gases from inside of the earth, and also ash and lava and pieces of rock and all kinds of stuff. It can rise actually at 400 miles per hour and even expand outward at several hundred miles per hour. If the volcano is hot enough and powerful enough, it can actually rise so high into the sky and for so long, it can actually create a huge thunderstorm cloud with particles bumping into one another really fast, create electricity, and actually create lightning. Like most natural disasters, geologists and volcanologists try to predict when a terrible volcano is gonna happen. And that's actually the premise of this movie. We're still trying to do that. Now, there are some markers in the field of geology that can tell you that a volcano might be coming, but we still can't predict with any accuracy when or how bad a volcanic eruption is gonna be. You know, a big violent eruption with that kind of force could certainly shatter buildings or 18-wheelers or windows that are in the way, and he's telling the kids to get down. There's not much you can do, of course, if you're in the path of this pyroclastic cloud or the pyroclastic flow of magma and hot gas and ash, but he's probably telling them to get down to stay away from the windows of the vehicle because there's flying debris, and that might help them a little bit. So that can actually expand outward that fast and kind of come at you at several hundred miles per hour. The hot gases and ash, they're rushing at them right now. We're trying to get out of the way. Let's see what happens. I don't think they'd be able to outdrive this hot cloud of gases and ash coming at them. When they're racing through the town here, it looks like they might be going like 40 or 50 miles an hour, and you know, the force of a volcano can certainly expand outward faster than that, so they might be in trouble here. Driving into a tunnel or a mine shaft like that might provide you some protection from the debris and from what's going on outside, but you know, the direction of the volcanic eruption is still going into that tunnel the same way they drove as well, so I'm not sure they'd be able to survive that even in there. Next up, crawl. It looks like we're in the middle of a hurricane here in this movie. Some parts are realistic, some parts are not. A hurricane is a low pressure system, a big organized 100-mile across storm or larger that forms over the ocean. And if the conditions are just right and the water in the ocean is warm enough, the storm will keep swirling, it'll keep big thunderstorms building, and it gets winds of 74 miles per hour or greater, and then it becomes a hurricane. This is actually pretty realistic, except it would be a little bit windier than this. I know from experience in a hurricane, it's almost impossible to stand up in. They don't look too flustered by the wind, which they would be. But you also get what's called the storm surge flooding, where if you live near the ocean, the level of the ocean actually rises. And that happens for two reasons. The wind from a hurricane piles the whole ocean into the land. Second of all, the lower pressure in the atmosphere inside of a hurricane actually exerts less of a downward force on the top of the ocean. So if you're not pushing the top of the ocean down as much, believe it or not, this bubble of higher ocean levels actually forms in the middle of a hurricane. It's from all the rising air. The atmosphere is almost lifting off of the earth itself. So the ocean itself is able to kind of lift up as well and fill that void. I wouldn't suggest walking through this. You see the car starting to float away. Even just a foot of moving water can wash a car away. Only 6 inches of flowing water can wash me or you off of our feet, even with our best efforts. The other dangerous thing about this, you don't want to be outside in a hurricane for obvious reasons, flying debris, but also because of power lines. Water is a really good conductor of electricity, so if that wire is still alive, it'll electrocute you if you're within even a somewhat close radius. You don't even have to be right next to it. It's a little bright for a hurricane. In a hurricane, the visibility is really low. You can't see the clouds. Everything's just gray and swirling and blowing. You don't have visibility of the cloud bases or of any bright spots from the sun like you see here. To prepare for a hurricane, if you live near the coast, because remember they only form over the ocean, it's good to have a few days supply of food, water, and a backup generator if you can, to run some basic parts of your home, like maybe the air conditioner or lights, things that you need to survive. Of course, if a really powerful hurricane is coming, officials will issue a voluntary evacuation where you can leave if you want, or a mandatory evacuation if it's really dangerous, where you have to leave and it's actually a crime to stay.
The eyes above us.
Yeah, so this is being in the hurricane eye. I've only been in a hurricane eye at night. If you're in the eye of a hurricane in the day, that's kind of a storm chaser or a meteorologist's dream because you get this spectacular visibility. It is completely calm. There's no wind or just a light breeze. And the clouds around you might be 45,000 feet tall, and you can actually see all of them around you. Very hard to get into the eye of a hurricane. Of course, most people don't want to be there, so not good for them. The eye wall of a hurricane is actually the most dangerous part, which is, if you think of the eye like a donut with the cutout in the middle, the eye itself, the hole in the middle of the donut, is completely still, and it might be sunny and no wind at all. But the donut itself surrounding that circular eye, that's the eye wall, and that's the ring of terror. That's, you know, where the strongest winds are, the most lightning can be. That's where all the destruction takes place. So that's another unrealistic thing. If they walked outside just before the eye got to them, that means they walked outside in the eye wall, which would have much, much stronger winds and be much less survivable than what we see here. Next up, Everest. This is quite realistic so far. You can get a thunderstorm in the mountains with lightning and rain, like what is base camp of Everest in this movie. And then at higher elevations, you wouldn't experience that as rain. It would be cold enough for snow or little pellets of ice to be hitting you. Of course, it'd be super windy in this storm at such a high elevation, and you'd need to brace yourself against the wind and brace any exposed skin from all that stuff flying at you in the air. And this is what's less realistic. If you're climbing Mount Everest or in any high alpine environment, you don't want any of your skin exposed. In an environment like this, the wind chill is constantly well below zero. It could be 80 below zero, which will give your exposed skin frostbite in just minutes. And also your eyes. You would never uncover your eyes, whether it was sunny up there or stormy up there. If it's stormy and windy, there's snow flying in your eyes. The cold wind is really harsh on your eyes, so you need to protect them from that. Even if it's sunny and a little less windy, it's so bright up there because you're above like a half of the Earth's atmosphere. You're above it, so there's little to protect you from how bright the sun is. Also, you've got a huge mirror under you and all around you. That's snow. So you can actually go snow blind, they call it, if you're not wearing really good sunglasses or really good goggles. So in meteorology, the term ice storm actually refers to freezing rain, which is not quite as exciting as this. It's where you have really cold air down at the ground, which is below freezing, but then up higher in the sky, it's quite warm. So if something falls from a cloud, it falls as a raindrop, and then it hits the ground, and then maybe the surface of your car or the road or the bridge is below freezing, so it turns into ice once it's on that surface. An ice storm doesn't necessarily mean that ice is falling from the cloud. Typically that's just little pieces of snow that are falling from a cloud. What we're we're looking at here is like a warm weather convective thunderstorm. These big, it looks like a piece of cauliflower, right? But a huge piece of cauliflower. The updrafts are really strong, so the cloud is growing and mushrooming and blossoming. It has really sharp edges on the cloud. We call that a cumuliform cloud. This only happens in warm, moist, tropical environments. So this is a thunderstorm you might see in Miami or even in the Midwest that could produce a tornado. But this is not the type of a thunderstorm that you would see close to Mount Everest in the Himalayas. You can get lightning in a mountain thunderstorm, even that high, but it won't be as common. And most storms that you'll get on Mount Everest, they don't look anything like this. They're not pretty and have sharp edges that you can see coming. They're kind of just like a blob of gray coming at you.
Doug, I'm gonna go to the summit to get oxygen. Okay, I'm gonna find oxygen.
And if you're climbing a mountain like this, just the willingness to turn around is how I would suggest preparing for Mount Everest type of storms. People have gotten in trouble when they're stubborn and there's a storm coming and they're 100 yards from the summit. But you know, 100 yards at 29,000 feet elevation takes you a while because you gotta walk really, really slowly. The willingness to turn around is a good survival tactic, I think, on Everest. Lightning and thunder are much more rare with snowstorms. That's why when you get what's called thunder snow, it's a really exciting thing for meteorologists. Typically, lightning and thunder are more of a warm weather thunderstorm occurrence. So there has been lightning on Mount Everest before. It's more likely down at base camp than it is on the summit. But you know, on a storm like this, they're showing frequent lightning and what looks like a summer day thunderstorm. It just wouldn't quite be like that. Thank you guys so much for watching these clips with me. I had a blast. This has been my lifelong passion, so this is really what gets me excited, and hope you enjoyed it as well. We'll see you next time.